Hi, welcome back. This is part two of our network automation overview with Ansible. So just to review, as we discussed, we are really focused on a couple of the pro tips here and the principles around, how DevOps and cloud really go together and just how important it is to be thinking about automation in the first place. So we looked at this from an overview perspective in the first video in this sequence, but to talk a little bit more here from an infrastructure engineering or a network engineering perspective, we're going to discuss here about human readability and version control of our infrastructure code and how Ansible works in the sense that it doesn't have anything to install on network devices, and why that's certainly a real differentiator in the marketplace today for configuration management systems. So in terms of readability, this should be pretty readable. This is a basic playbook that installs an OS on a Nexus 9K. It then waits for the device to come back with a new image, and it finally checks to see if the OS is basically ready. And the principle here is that readable code is maintainable code. And there are classic studies that have shown that for every person hour that's spent writing code, another 4 hours will be spent reading it. And so when we think about the fact that it actually costs your organization more to read code than it does to write it, it begins to make a lot of sense to make the code as readable as possible. And this is why from an earlier video, we talked about at the deeper end of the spectrum, Google, Facebook, et cetera, style guides are very common for all programming languages. And I think it's definitely important to talk about what you're getting pretty much out of the box with Ansible in terms of readability by working with it. And we also, in general with the network, it is pretty much the beating heart of everything else that you do from a technology perspective in your organization. And so, when we think about the fact that it really is the final frontier of infrastructure code adoption, being in a position where we're no longer just kind of trading around network scripts from Notepad and starting to put those in GitHub, it really empowers us to start collaborating and start really improving on what our practices are in terms of trying to automate things on the network and just managing routine operations. So I think for anybody that is more or less uninitiated with Ansible, there are probably 4 basic concepts to discuss, and I think all of these are pretty valuable in terms of network automation in particular. So in terms of the command line, we'll talk about that here momentarily. We'll also talk about the inventory and the fact that really nothing happens from an Ansible perspective if you don't have an inventory. It pretty much is kind of like a core concept there. We'll also look at playbooks and specifically tasks and the basic parts of tasks. And we'll look at secret management. So in an operational environment, real world, it's very important to actually be able to protect your passwords, not have them in clear text, not have them getting redirected to log files and what have you. And Ansible-vault can help quite a bit there. So just an overview of the command line. So there are 4 main programs that we work with on the command line. The first is Ansible. That's usually for ad hoc commands like one-offs, just to see if a system's alive to ping it or something. Ansible-playbook is more of the workhorse, and it's involved in orchestrating many playbooks against many hosts potentially. Ansible-doc is helpful in terms of being able to look up module references and things like that. Certainly better sometimes than just kind of Googling and hoping for the best. And as we talked about Ansible-vault, and we've shown this in a previous video, we'll go in a little bit more about what it's capable of doing here momentarily, but it is basically the 4th command that we would want to talk about. So in terms of inventory, going back to readability, this should also be pretty readable. This is an INI format for a static file, which is the basic way that you would work with an inventory in Ansible. And so we can group all of our firewalls, all of our switches, and then we can also have a hierarchical relationship between those as network systems. Probably slightly less relevant for a lot of network automation discussions, but you can also run dynamic scripts that would generate through AWS EC2 instances or Active Directory computers, things like that, generate your inventory on demand. And you can also include hosts as runtime inventory additions, and you can also do things like select specific hosts through wildcards, matching like a naming pattern, a number scheme or something like that, and also just regular expressions. So you can do all of that with your inventory. The next basic concept to discuss is really the parts of a task. Also, I guess the nature of the fact that a playbook is made up of one or more plays, which is made up of one or more tasks. And so the parts of a task, there are four main ones. So there's the name, and this should always be as human readable, plain English as possible. So we just want to check the installed OS for a newly installed version. And since almost everything that we do with Ansible happens from a module perspective, this is the Nexus command module, and it has command module arguments, basically. And finally, there's also the matter of task control and working with keywords there, where we're registering variables that we can use in other parts of a playbook, et cetera, and just do other things to maybe manage like a service restart or something along those lines. But these are the basic parts of a task. So Ansible-vault, so it can do a number of things. It can create new encrypted files. It can also encrypt your existing files. It can edit your encrypted files. It can rotate passwords for those encrypted files. It can certainly decrypt them. And it also lets you run in line with Ansible Playbook. So the idea here is that we're basically combining a Vault encrypted file with Ansible Playbook. And we've talked about this in a demo in a previous video around integrating Ansible and Slack. So you might want to check that out if you haven't seen it already for a live look. So talking about Ansible and network devices, so anybody who is initiated to having worked with Ansible in the past from a server infrastructure perspective may be curious about how it works on network devices, because as we've talked about, one of the strengths of Ansible is that it doesn't require anything to be installed on network equipment. So how does that work? So with a traditional server instance like a Linux node or something like that, what's really happening is the Ansible control node, like your laptop or whatever, in a simplistic case, is sending out some type of program to run on the remote system that just lives long enough to be able to send a JSON payload back. That's ultimately what all Ansible really cares about. Typically, that's like a Python script of some kind. It just does all the work and reconciles everything that it needs to. Since installing agents on network equipment isn't really a thing, generally with OEM appliances, it has to run a little bit differently. And so in the case of network modules, they actually run on the control node, and they do all the reconciliation on basically, again, your simplistic case, like a laptop or something like that. And the key thing here is to understand the way that rollback works. And so that's like basically a network module backup file that goes into the Playbooks backup directory in case something had to be restored, didn't work well, or didn't come back with a clean exit code, something like that. But otherwise, you work with your Ansible playbooks for network devices the same way that you do for pretty much everything else. Like the commands that we talked about, all of that, generally the same. And for network devices in general, you would want to go with Red Hat Ansible Engine. So that's it for kind of an infrastructure engineer approach or network engineer approach. And next, we'll be talking more from a software development perspective. About module support, and also talking a little bit more about the opportunity ahead to do much better than basically all but about 10% of the ecosystem there from a network equipment perspective. Just kind of talk about the art of the possible. So see you on the next video. Thanks.